we come once again to celebrate our movement for the universal basics of income, services, and rights. With me again is my lovely co-host, Jackie Sawicki. Jackie, want to let the folks out there know what basic we're covering today?
Yes, today we're going to continue our discussion on this month's theme of education. This time we're going to be talking about expanding basic education from adopting universal pre-K to universal higher education, including trade schools and that kind of thing. So, yeah, we're going to be talking about education. And we're also going to have a very special guest at the end of the podcast.
Yes, we are. We're going to have our friend of the program. He's been with us many times, whether it be in the Hill of Roses Day or, now at the People's Basics. It's Liam O'Mara. He's been a contributor here at the network. He just recently came out with an article for us. And so we wanted to be able to expand on his piece there. He is a professor at, a university now that he's no longer campaigning and running for Congress. And so we really wanted to dissect his opinion of what really needed to happen, primarily more so for the college education. But before we start talking about college, Jackie, I think the first place we got to start when it comes to expanding education, and maybe this is just my opinion and I'd love to hear your own. I think the biggest expansion of education that is necessary right now is making sure that the youngest kids among us are starting to get an education early and that everyone can get a pre-K education. So I wanted to ask you, what's your opinion on that? When it comes to the expansion of education, do you think that it needs to have any level of prioritization? Do you think college is more important? Or do you think pre-K is more important? How do you think kids need to be, or not kids, all people need to be learning?
Yeah, before we started recording and researching for this episode, I was a little torn. Everybody knows that pre-K is important and there's a lot of benefits for children, but I wasn't 100% sold. But yeah, after doing some research for recording, there is really, really overwhelming positive effects of having children learning, as soon as possible. And it also helps poor, disadvantaged kids, kids with learning disabilities, getting them that head start and preparing them for school, their school career. It is helpful and it is beneficial. Part of me, and we'll probably talk about homeschooling, but, my mom was very proactive in our education, and she really helped. I mean, I'm a lifelong learner because of her insistence that education is important, and she taught us to read, before we even went to school. So part of me is like, parents should definitely be stepping up and doing a lot more. We shouldn't put all the burden on teachers, but pre-K is beneficial, and there's a lot of socializing that, and it is helpful for parents too. So I think I'm sold on the idea of universal pre-K, and a lot of other countries are doing it and they're showing the benefits as well.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing to consider is, obviously it would be wonderful if parents can spend the time with their kids that they so desire, and that they have the complete choice of saying, you know what, if this isn't the right experience for me and I want to take more of an active role in trying to help my kid in its early years, that they could do that. But you're right that some people right now struggle with that access, and it's nice if they could have that standardized public option basically for them to choose to be able to bring their kids to in case they need to continue working for their own family in that situation. Obviously, we support a lot of measures to help that economic burden so that parents can have a real choice. But I think this notion of providing the option of education, and not just, daycare people, but quality educators for young minds, would be a very beneficial thing for society as a whole. The first question I'd have for you is, right now there's a lot of conversation around, these 3 to K models or even 2 to K models, like where kids would start pre-K at 2 or 3. How much do you think we should be trying to provide as pre-K education, in your opinion? Do you think there should be periods of time that is automatically given to parents to spend with their kids at the beginning? where do you think that point of public education should start?
Yeah, in a perfect world, we would have universal parental leave for the first 2 to 3 years. I mean, 3 years, minimum in a perfect world. So I am a big fan of parents being able to stay home and raise their kids. We know that the first couple of years are incredibly important to a whole host of developmental, be it mental, emotional, physical, like having parents at home. And I'm not trying to make anybody feel guilty because it's not fair the way that the system
Yeah.
is set up right now. But in a perfect world, other countries are doing it. You can stay home with your kid for a year or two, or parents switch off and take turns. And, like it's just, you can't even put a price tag on that. It is so important. And so my like perfect concept would be probably 3 years at home with the kids, and then at start preschool then, I guess. I don't have kids, so this isn't something I've had
Sure.
to think too hard about. And but yeah, it's ideally time with parents should be almost more important than pre-K, but that's my
I
personal opinion.
that's actually reasonably debated. I can actually understand that position because you're right. Like the parents should be able to be the ones spending time with their children, actually imparting like the ability to spend attention with them. Because the individualized time, the increased amount of words that a child is going to be hearing, and the actual activity of them processing new information during those early years can be probably even more informative. As we've been saying, there's this notion of just neuroplasticity that the earlier in a child's life, the more capability it has at that moment to learn. And so, yeah, starting earlier is going to be especially beneficial. And I think at that point, traditional educational models aren't as applicable to babies. It's more just socialization time during those periods of life. And so, myself, I personally try to take more of a total of a 2 year approach, 1 year per parent to be able to spend at home, or they could do it together if they so choose, 1 year together. But I think that's how I would be proposing it. But obviously, over time, if we are continuing to be productive, we should expand that more and more. Like, the notion of one day reaching a post scarcity society would be great, and people could spend as much time with their kids as they want. But I think, at least in the interim, right now in America and comparing us to the rest of the world, I think we could realistically, right now, today, implement 1 year parental leave programs through our federal government for each parent. Because I don't want it to just be like only the mom stays home and it's only given to maternal leave. I think
Right.
both parents should get that ability and that it can stack to a total of 2 years. Um, but let's now talk about the pre K portion. So we mentioned that there's a lot of benefits to pre K. Some of which are, they're just better prepared for kindergarten. They're starting with more socialization skills and key, understandings of language. You're also, as you said, giving poor students with like learning disabilities more advantages. I wanted to hear, in your opinion, if there were any like models or countries that you think we could be looking towards for programs to be considering as either rollouts by state or even like a national rollout for America.
I mean, the French model, I think I'm pretty sure they get 2 years, and they have had that since the 19th century. They really value that. Finland and Sweden have a sliding scale. It's kind of like for those in poverty who can't afford pre-K, they subsidize it. So that's maybe even something we can consider. And there are states that have legislated pre-Ks, like New York,
Mhm.
Berlin, but Germany. But they do. But Berlin, they have to pay for meals and activities. So there are a bunch of states and city municipalities all across America that are rolling out different versions of. There was even one I read about that's like a lottery based free pre-K. So we know that it's important, and individual states and cities are trying to make efforts to get more children access to it. So yeah, we should just roll it out nationally. We have the
Yeah.
funds. I
I
mean,
mean,
we
that's the
know
thing
it's
too.
helpful. Yeah.
It really is just a funding prioritization thing. I think it's pretty common sense of why it might make sense to provide that education. Obviously, some people just appreciate it as the form of childcare. We're obviously talking about it as actually just an educational benefit in itself.
Yeah.
But it's not that expensive, frankly. But it's kind of hard for some localities to be able to fund these efforts themselves. Especially as we were mentioning beforehand, it's especially hard for poor areas to be able to put their own public pre-Ks into place because, as we talked about in our previous education episode, we know that so much of the funding for public education is very dependent on property taxes. And so, for poor areas, that's going to be generating far less in property tax revenue to help fund these types of programs. But doing something like this, like nationwide, doesn't have that much of a significant cost if you really put it into perspective with some of our other spending items. According to a study by Lynch and Vogel, the cost of implementing a universal pre K program in America would come out to $26 billion per year. And now, if you think about that compared to some of our other discretionary budgetary items, like there's always the big culprit, the military. Like when you put
Yeah.
into perspective, like that is what, like, oh God, 1/30th roughly the size. So if we cut 1/30th, 3% off the military budget, we can send all of our babies to pre-K. Let's
Right.
round up to like 1/33rd, like let's say, or 3.33%. We then could maybe even do our paid family leave. Like it's a prioritization effort. What is going to be making us
Absolutely.
more secure? Is it these more developed children and parents who now have proper childcare if they so need to choose to go to the workforce, or more military? I think it's pretty clear. I think we know that we can afford $26 billion. But I wanted to ask you, do you see any of like the problems that not just expanding it out? Like obviously there's the idea of like let's make sure that it's commonly accessible for everyone regardless of cost and location. But how do we actually make like pre-Ks better in your opinion? I know you don't have your kid by yourself, but do you have any ideas of some of the issues that we're facing in how we're delivering pre-K today for kids?
Well, I know, like, most educational positions, they're underpaid. So we'll just
Yeah.
have to start there, and then they have to buy their own supplies. So there's just the funding issue to begin with. Some kids have social anxiety or separation anxiety. So that's something. And, again, I'm a little woo woo. I think we should be teaching children methods like, um, I think I've talked about that before, the pause or meditation or self reflection. We could be teaching kids more emotional intelligence. I think
Yeah.
that's something just generally in America we lack, and coping mechanisms. So maybe have more mental health professionals in the mix, and maybe not just teachers. I don't,
I think that's brilliant in suggestion in my opinion because I think that works on a couple skills. Like during that age, there are certain types of skills that kids really are more needing, and socialization, the ability to communicate and understand things are essential, as well as just learning relative like discipline in certain ways.
Mhm.
Like during those early ages, it's really trying to establish like a socialization of how do you interact with others. Because,
Yeah,
for those first few
boundaries.
years, like hopefully, as we were just talking about, we'd love for the kids to be able to stay with their parents. Very often during those first few years, they're not having as much socialization with others. It's just the parents.
Mhm.
But now it's kind of this notion of, hey, there are way more people out there. You got to adjust to that. And so, like, having some like mental health professionals to understand this, and at least maybe, even if it's not like being in the classroom, but like assisting teachers to understand how to handle these problems better and providing support to teachers too, I think could be big in itself. Because I think there's like the problem of like, you're going to have just some, in general, unruly children at that age. Like, I can speak from my own experience being a big
Yeah.
brother. Consistently through age 2, kids are terrible. They're unruly. They're testing all their boundaries, and so
Yeah.
they like teachers just need help for like how do you handle these kids? Like it's not just teaching them things. It's how do you, in a way, like somewhat control kids, bring them in, get them under control. Like you obviously want to teach them the skills so that they can do this for themselves and emotionally regulate and understand certain skills, but you also have to know how to you like rein some people in and keep them from being a distraction for some of the other kids potentially.
Yeah,
So I
and it's
think you're right
funny.
on that.
Yeah, it's funny too because kids teach other kids, kids teach their
Hmm.
parents. So I'm just reminded of a time when my little nephew, he was a hellraiser, ADHD, dyslexic. I mean, he was just such a problem child, and I kind of taught him how to meditate, and we listened to like Tools Lateralis, which is like a very like I don't know, cerebral CD, and it's like very meditational. And I overheard him once after trying to teach him how to ground and center and be calm. He literally said, he said, "When I'm still, it feels like ants are crawling all over me," which I think is a great descriptor of ADHD because like if I'm not like moving up here, my toes are probably moving or something like
Yeah.
so. But it's so funny because after we had our little meditation session, I heard him teaching his little sister, yeah, you gotta cross your legs and breathe really slow, and then you're gonna open your third eye, which I didn't even teach him that, but it was really funny. And kids are sponges. They see how we all learn to be more mindful. We can all learn to be a little more centered. And they see, their reflections of their parents, of their environment, of their surroundings. And so if we can cultivate calmness in ourselves, if we can teach that in our children, it's just this beautiful ripple effect. So it
It's
really is
I
valuable.
love I love that description. It really makes me feel the theory of like educating one educates many. Because
Absolutely.
it's this notion of when you invest into a person, their ability to then be able to do more and be more capable will be able to help others. And the notion should be just, and we should be providing that to everyone so that everyone can start to be able to help each other. And that's going to be very naturally synergistic when everyone is afforded to these opportunities. But I now wanted to kind of transition to what we had as our main conversation with Liam, and that's college. Education, in my opinion, is a lifelong experience. And I think society should reflect that notion. That we should be educating throughout our lifetimes and that we should be providing the lifeline to people to be able to constantly reskill themselves without having to fall into debt. What do we want people to do when they lose a job? We want them to get themselves re-educated, reskilled, and reemployed. And how do you do that? Well, right now we say go take on a cost. Right now that's an expensive cost, and that's to someone who just lost their job. Does
Right.
that make sense? Like now, mind you, not always does a job loss mean you have to go to another industry, but more and more in the 21st century, when we have more and more skills being automated away, not just the physical labor of past forms of automation, but now increasingly forms of mental task automation as well, we're going to have a constantly more dynamically educated society. And we talk about a bunch of different models in that conversation with Liam, but just this notion that we, in our whole lifetime, need this ability to relearn and retool, and this should be something accessible to all, makes college and trade school and these forms of education necessary, in my opinion, and a basic that all should have. Um, do you agree with that notion that education should be the whole lifetime, or do you think it should be a certain amount of years that we provision? Like we've chosen right now, obviously K to 12, we've chosen a set amount of years as society to afford. What do you think as that model of how much education we should be trying to provide?
Yeah, I mean, if you don't think, I think QAnon and the Donald Trump cult is the perfect indicator of why we need lifelong education. The boomers the things that they learned in school aren't even true anymore. Like so many times my mom will say something and I'm like, that's not correct, but it's something she learned in school, but it's completely obsolete because we know so much more now.
Yeah.
So it is absolutely a lifelong venture. And I think it is cool that seniors, I don't know if this is a Texas thing or a national thing, but seniors can take like so many free credit hours nowadays. They can take some free classes. And so yeah, we should be like continually educating ourselves. We should be like helping seniors. I mean, they're preyed upon by the millions, with fraud, because they aren't savvy
Yeah.
enough to know these phishing scams and stuff like that. Like, Google is calling you every day. It's not really Google, it's like spam. It's calling you every day and saying, "Oh,
Yeah.
we your Google account is, we need you to." And seniors fall for it, and they give them money, and they give them sensitive information. So we need to be. I mean, yeah, college, pre-K, all of it. We need to be constantly asking ourselves if what we think is true, and like going to the source and seeing if it's still applicable, if it's still true, because so much of what we know, even the stuff that I was taught, I'm 40 years old, and stuff that I was taught, I had a teacher once. I asked, if we've never seen dinosaurs, how do we know that they look like this? And she goes, don't ask questions like that. Well, now we know the
Yeah.
dinosaurs that we were taught in our time is like, not, it's not correct. They know more now. So yeah, we need to constantly be revisiting what we think we know.
Yeah, and I think the core thing that I loved in what you said, because it goes very hand in hand with my notion of how society is constantly changing and we constantly need to adapt, is how it's not just what is happening to us in our lives that is changing. Our understanding of what is changing. And so I think this notion of having education that constantly refreshes and that people should have access to it is a totally worthwhile notion. What we knew in the past is not the same now, and that exists so frequently just in the scientific method that we're trying to constantly build off of. And so I humbly accept that this notion of lifelong learning needs to exist. And so for the people who worry, like, okay, what happens if we say, okay, everyone can go take college courses whenever they want? How do you do that? You have capacity issues. Yeah, we're going to have to do some level of investment to make it more accessible. But long term, I see a lot of education, not all of education, but a lot of education being increasingly scaled so that it doesn't cost as much extra by going online. Not
Yeah.
every skill is going to be that. There's going to be a lot of value in still doing these socialization skills and really having more well-rounded conversations and understandings of what is happening in the world and the applications of certain knowledges and skills. But I do think that to breed accessibility, where someone is like, you know what, I want to constantly retool while I'm doing a job still, potentially. So maybe I'm not being reactive to when I get fired. I'm doing it constantly while I'm on my current job, potentially. Okay, they have that opportunity through online courses. So I think these types of accessibility issues by doing things like, it's a very intersectional issue, getting things like public broadband to everyone so that they have access to this wider, network of technology and education sources, like even things like Khan Academy, are really going to be helpful long term in scaling certain educational models. Because I do wonder how fundamentally the dynamic of college itself needs to change. And so, my first question to you, Jackie, is what do you think works well and is the actual purpose of a college degree compared to high school? Because a lot of people might say, hey, you know what? All these skills you should be prepared for, you should have already gotten them by high school. Like, what do you
Right.
think the fundamental purpose of college should be in helping people?
Well, first we have to like acknowledge that like high school does not prepare you for life at all.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it doesn't. People get out of high school and they're just thrown for a loop and they're preyed upon again, maybe because they, you know, don't have the critical thinking skills to know when they're being preyed upon. So, like, I'm thinking like high interest loans and that kind of stuff. Um, yeah, college can be really liberating. There's so much aspects of it, the social interaction, like, you know, most people live for a long time in one place, and so when you go to college and you're, you know, inundated with people from all different cultures and backgrounds, that's really, I mean, that in itself is educational. Like, traveling, if you are leaving your city or state to go to college, that is incredibly educational, transformative experience, just going somewhere else. um, Depending on the courses you take and what you decide you want to do. I mean, that goes back to that question of, what should we have the general, you know, associate's degree where we get the basics and then we specialize, or do we take some time between high school and college
Yeah.
and we ask ourselves, we, you know, do the work and see where we want to go. But even then, I mean, I'm 40 years old and I didn't know what I really wanted to do till I was probably 30, 35. So God, I mean, who knows? But some people know from a very early age. So college, ideally, college is an experience where you meet other people. You find, if you come from a place like I do where I felt like an alien, you find people, you find your kin, you know, you find your clan. So that's really cool too, that can happen in
Yeah.
college. You know, taking like philosophy classes, learning how to think differently. That should be the real goal of college, is like just being able to see different perspectives and explore different paradigms. And you don't have to buy into every one of them. That is intelligence, right?
Yeah. You know,
So yeah.
I have to say, you know, part of that kind of liberation is so much of what college was for myself is you finally get the time to do much more choice for yourself. You get much more specialization for yourself. And most importantly to me, the part that you were acknowledging very much so, the socialization aspect, the people you meet, the experiences you go through that you're taken out of this environment you've lived through most of your life and thrown into an experience with people from all around the country and even sometimes around the world. I
Yeah.
think that's an incredibly liberating experience to be, you know, acculturated to so many different lived experiences. If anything, the memories that I have most are the, you know, frankly, the conversations outside of class. Very little of the appeal, frankly, of college is, you know, the actual memories and skills you're going to build in college. A lot of that you end up just learning on the job a lot of the times. But more
Mm.
so, the ability of college is to take you outside of your existing environment and expose you to more experiences and perspectives outside of your existing bubble, as well as to allow you to explore an issue in more depth to make sure if you want to concentrate that and work in that field, you have some background understanding of the subject and a general understanding. And furthermore, I see it as a general space for people to start actually practicing some of these skills more. Like, for instance, there is a lot more opportunities to do research at these universities because, as a country, we've put so much of our public investment dollars into these research programs. And so often we have these programs to really do great initiatives that invest in students. Obviously, it'd be great if we could do that even more often in high school. But I see that as an opportunity where we've said, hey, you're an adult now. We feel more comfortable investing in you to build something comparatively to children. I think that's a great opportunity for people who might not otherwise have an experience of being able to, you know, do it on their own. They get to have this almost, you know, old fashioned mentorship program. You have a lot of these professors who primarily just do research at the university. It's the biggest difference between having a full-time professor versus an adjunct is that full-timer, they're doing research and that can lead to lifelong careers for people if their research can go successfully. So I think there's a lot to be able to have within a college experience. But there are also some challenges because, you know, it doesn't just stop at tuition. Um, you know, one of the big things that comes to my mind when I went to college, a lot of the expenses comes with textbooks. It comes with the notion of room and board and the food that's associated with it. Because again, more often you're no longer just eating with your family, you're off on your own. So you have to sometimes bear that cost, whatever, meal plans, whatever. So there's a cost to that. And so, you know, it doesn't just stop at tuition. And so this is why I think, you know, it's not just, oh, we're going to provide all those things necessarily for free. These people are now adults at this point when they're going off to college, and they're going to hopefully have these other programs, like, in my opinion, a universal basic income, which should be helping to support them. And that there should be
Absolutely.
general housing within the area that should stabilize the demand for on campus housing so that there's a lower fixed cost of on campus housing if you want to live there because people can more affordably live in the surrounding areas too. So one of the things that should be known is people are adults. They still have to live. It's not like when you go off to college, you're suddenly at Hogwarts and everything's just la
Right,
di
right.
da provided for you. You're
Exactly.
still kind of living a real
No,
life.
it's
People have to work jobs to often put themselves through, not just for
yeah,
you know expenses of tuition, but just to live. And so I think
yeah.
that needs to be acknowledged very often as well when these people are going through that experience.
For sure. And, Matthew Yeager, he's I almost feel like he's our resident college expert because he's a student and he's
Yeah.
written about student issues now twice. But yeah, he's wrote an article about UBI and college students and, just how much pressure and debt and how UBI would just alleviate so much stress and anxiety. And college students, the anxiety levels of these poor kids are skyrocketing. Like, just mental health issues are run rampant in colleges because of the high stakes, because of the cost. You know, they see their whole future. I mean, we've been told our entire lives, you have to go to college, you have to go to college if you want to have a decent living, and a lot of us bought into that. And um, I personally didn't finish college. I took a lot of college classes. I never lived on campus. I always had this like dream of going to college and like having that real college experience of living in the dorms, and I couldn't afford it. And so I lived in a college town, Lubbock, Texas, and I went to a community college outside of Lubbock, Texas. I drove 30 minutes away to go to community college, and it was still an awesome experience. But I moved out when I was 17 years old. I've been taking care of myself since I was 17. So, not everybody has the luxury of having that
Yeah.
idyllic college experience, and it's hard. And so UBI would be incredible, and that it speaks so much to the way that we prioritize things. I mean, you talk about the budget being a moral document, and we have infinite resources for selling arms and manufacturing munitions, but when it comes to like making children and parents' lives easier and more resilient, it's like, well, where are we going to come? Where are we going to get the money? And they never ask that when it comes to
Yeah.
bombs. So yeah, it's
It
definitely
is.
something that's very personal to me.
I strongly feel you on that front. And you're right. It is, again, a prioritization question because when we talk about these budgets with discretionary funds in the trillions, and we are asking for a notion of free college, which costs 79 billion in total, which we can fund off a financial transaction tax of basically 0.1%. And like be done with it. Make Wall Street pay for our kids to get educated, which is going to in turn increase the productivity of our society, which is going to allow these banks to make their money back because now all these different parts of society are thriving more and the things they're investing in are now making higher returns for them. Like the cycle works when we invest in ourselves in these notions of general ROI, and education consistently is one of those greatest performing functions. And
Yeah.
so it also comes into the play of like, well, what are we basically funding at our current universities? Why did the prices get so high? Why is the student debt as high as it is right now? Like, what caused this big problem? To me, it comes into play with two key functions. Some people don't like market economies. I see this very much as that. There became an increased level of demand, as what you said. We had this huge messaging campaign to so many high school students that if you wanted to get ahead in this now increasingly dynamic economy, this new globalized economy, you got to get a college degree if you want to succeed. So this created a big pressure on a lot of students saying, hey, if I want to be a success, if I don't want to be seen as that kid that got left behind and didn't go to college, I got to get there. I got to take on the loan if I'm going to do it, even because I know it's going to pay off in the long run. They give you the
Yep.
notion, and in general, this holds true. It's an average, but there's an average, and we should talk about what average actually means. An average of 2 million in extra earnings through a lifetime. But what an average means is that usually there's people below it and there's
Yeah.
people above it. And so it can be really skewed when you have a couple of those people above it who are some of those, college educated people that are far exceeding that 2 million. And it's in the past very, it's this notion of kind of like this social fraternity of people. It's like a gatekeepership of admission for only certain select people. And you get to have this inner network of, hey, my dad's the VP over here and I can get you a job there. My uncle is this. And it's this, socialization experience that connects you with high opportunity jobs. That's so much of what the value of like these Ivy institutions. So
Yep.
people really are trying to, demand these fields. And so they get this notion of, oh, I'm going to make this average of 2 million more in my lifetime. And so many people don't get it. And so they have this demand. And then the government decided, hey, we're going to basically be a guarantor. So anyone can get this, regardless of their level of funding or admissions or whatever. It became this basic guarantor, but it came with very, stringent restrictions on being able to declare bankruptcy on it. It had immense interest rates on top of it. And then you have this notion of at the same time, the federal government is starting to cut funding to colleges for these states. And so it's like, okay, they're not getting as much funding. And so who in turn starts to bear the cost instead of the general ledger of public funding and taxes paying for the education? Oh, it's the individual. And so this in turn is creating this huge rising debt level because people have been sold largely on a false bill of goods. And it's not necessarily a lie at the first place that people were like, oh, hey, people on average make this. It's just that, well, you know, it's A, an average, and B, it's mainly its benefit is the socialization club. It's like if you keep having the total number of students, it's like, is everyone going to get that same benefit? It only was producing those averages because there's like